Hey and welcome. This is a video different from the usual because it is a reaction video, which I don't do very often. But this particular time I found a video that I believe is very interesting, and I would like to say something about that. The video is from Ward Carroll's channel. If you don't follow it already, I suggest you to do so. It is managed by an ex-US Navy pilot. And while I often don't agree with the analysis and his stance, the quality of the information, the quality of the guest that he has is outstanding, and it's definitely worth listening. In this case, we're watching together an interview with Admiral Sam Paparo of clear Italian origin, who is the commander of the Indo-PACOM, which is the largest territorially speaking US command, and it is facing China, so it has a good possibility of being at the forefront of a potential conflict in the near future. We won't listen to the whole video. There are just some points that I would like to comment about, but I suggest you to watch the whole interview. The link will be in the comments below.
You were saying the threat is complicated in that not only is it your military threat, that threat also happens to be a majority shareholder in a lot of companies that we deal with, right?
The People's Republic of China is the #3 trading partner for the United States of America. And there's a profound amount of integration between the two societies and the two economies. And it adds dimensions of complexity on the strategic problem that there could be crisis or conflict elements to our relationship. But both nations have a significant stake in peace, because if we would end up fighting the People's Republic of China, both economies would contract significantly.
So this is perfectly true. This is a big difference between the Cold War with the Soviet Union and the current second Cold War with China. However, there is no reason for this to be the case. This is the result of very specific political and economical choices that have been done in the West and in China in the last 3 or 4 decades. And despite the fact that it's going to take a long time, there is no reason not to reverse this. But there's an element I wholeheartedly agree with the Admiral, that is both countries have a big stake in peace, but not because the economy is going to contract, but because in war, people die. And actually dying is the worst thing that may happen to a human.
And then the relationships as well, whereas the People's Republic of China was a junior partner to Russia, those relationships have changed. And now the PRC, by dint of the success of their economy and by dint of the PRC's rise, is now the greatest challenge to American security, freedom, well-being, and those of our allies and partners.
And this I don't agree. China must not be necessarily a threat to anyone. In the same way, the United States should not be a threat to anyone. I always advocate on this channel the primacy of diplomacy. And I have already said a few times what the Americans and the Chinese should do is meet midway, maybe not midway at all, and have a nice conference where they sort of split the world in their spheres of influence. Is this nice? No, particularly for those who are inside those spheres of influences, but that's what great powers do. We who are not American or Chinese or Russian or Indian, well, we just have to be pragmatic and do what we can.
So let's look at the threat through the military lens, acknowledging what you just said about the complexities, because on some plane it is a direct military threat, and we're seeing some cat and mouse, J-15s, J-20s on the wings of our P-8s, provocative stuff that we used to look forward to on an alert launch. So when I see that, I'm like, well, that's not a problem. That is an exciting day on cruise. Something could happen, and it's certainly not something you want to see on a daily basis. Bilats between Russians and Chinese off the coast of Alaska.
And this is one of those situations in which I don't agree with Carl. While China is a military threat to the United States are a military threat to China, because Those P8s that he has just mentioned are there in the first place, thousands of kilometers from their borders. We all know why this happens. As I said, this is great powers politics, but this is how it is.
As we're sitting here, and correct me on this if I'm wrong, you don't have a carrier strike group in your AOR. The one that was in your AOR, the Lincoln, is still in the Fifth Fleet AOR, trying to cover that hotspot. Do you have any concerns about this sort of, asset sharing that we have to do that was unheard of back in our day as JOs, right? I mean, we actually had a 2.0 carrier presence in the Med on my first two cruises. And you think of that now, you're like, wow, we had an obnoxious amount of carrier strike groups, or what we used to call carrier battle groups.
15.
So 15, right? And so, how are you doing with respect to this demand signal and the fact that you currently don't have an aircraft carrier in your AOR?
Presently, I do in George Washington, and this is a recent development. But we accelerated George Washington, who were doing some integration training in San Diego, and we moved George Washington west of the date line in order to be more readily available if need be. And now George Washington, who is fragged to go into a maintenance availability in Yokosuka later this year, we have safely brought her forward in order to account for the gap that Abe has left.
So, this is a very interesting point in which we can hear from the voice of one of the commanders the problems that the current strategic stance of the United States is not completely tackling. Aircraft carriers, which are such a large part of the American capability of projecting power around the world, are becoming increasingly complex, which typically means that an aircraft carrier can be operational for a few months, typically 6, but can be more, and these days is generally more. But after that time, the readiness starts to decline because the aircraft need depot maintenance that can be executed on the carrier, but also the carrier and the ships of the battle group need maintenance, stuff breaks, and it needs to be repaired, and it can't always be repaired by the crew at sea or in a non-friendly port. When the readiness starts decaying, you need maintenance at your home port for a few months, and every few years you also need a long stop of a few years to refuel the nuclear reactors and add improvements and fix everything that was broken, that you kept going even though it was broken, and so on. Moreover, to have the carrier wing ready, it is necessary a long period of training before each deployment. Again, we are talking many months. So, what's the point? The point is that this instrument has become so complicated and it requires so much effort to be deployed that is very difficult to have enough of them. So, this is the reason why I believe the light carriers are becoming increasingly important. For light carriers, I mean the LHA and LHDs that usually carry Marine Corps F-35Bs, but also there are a number of NATO allies that have this capability. I'm Italian. Italy has two beautiful carriers that carry F-35Bs, which is a high-end capability. Obviously, the numbers are relatively small, but they are ships that are much easier to handle, that can be ready much more quickly, can go in and out of maintenance much more quickly than supercarriers. And this is, in my view, the main reason why it is debatable if the United States should keep having such a large fleet of supercarriers. Mind, I'm not saying that carriers are obsolete, far from that, but maybe it is worth moving toward a model where there are fewer carriers ready to surge when they're needed and not deployed. This is, by the way, what the Chinese are probably doing with their ships, and that the thinking that the French and the British have adopted behind their carriers. So I think this is an interesting point of debate.
Because over the summer, the Russians were doing their Okean 24, that's Russian for ocean, exercise in the far North Pacific. And between naval capabilities and aircraft, we're operating along the Aleutians. And we had to put significant force, submarine force, surface force, and maritime patrol force in the far North Pacific.
Obviously, there is no risk of real kinetic encounters between the Russians and the Americans during these large training exercises. What the admiral is saying is that they need to keep an eye on what the Russians are doing, mostly to acquire intelligence. And the Russians do the same with the Americans. That's another part of the great powers game. So there was no hostility. This is what happens normally all around the world.
Now, as the US support to our allies and partners and our new partners has manifested itself, it is beginning to eat away at the air missile maritime magazines available here in the Indo-Pacific. Now, I'm not saying that it is uh, it gutted Indo-PACOM, but for every standard missile SM-2, SM-6 that's employed from a destroyer, that is a material reduction in inventory, and those capabilities are applicable. And then JDAMs are another example. JDAMs have gone into the Middle East. I'd be dishonest with you if I did not tell you that this provision of JDAM and standard missiles and AIM-9s, and in some cases AIM-120s, did not directly affect the magazine depth.
This is another interesting subject that is not often recognized in the debate, I mean, in the public debate on the internet. Modern ammunitions are complex, expensive, and resource intensive, and they have the cardinal sin that they can't be manufactured at scale. It's hard to imagine a LISCO situation in which these guided systems, these highly sophisticated weapons, are not going to be consumed faster than they can be produced. This is the problem that the Russians have, but they could cope with this more easily than the West can because of their mixed economy system. This is something we will cover in the future. But in the West, it is really difficult to tackle with this problem because it is tackled between an industrial framework, which is not conducive to this kind of large scale, high intensity manufacturing situations that may happen in the future in a potential conflict against China, which I believe is going to happen, or in a conflict against Russia, which I don't believe is going to happen. And just to be clear, to restore the amount of weapons that have been sent to Ukraine or to the Middle East or have been used against the Houthis, we are literally talking years, while the supplies that have been provided have been burned through in mere months.
So the stat I have here is China's Navy is on paper the largest in the world, battle force of over 370 ships, expected growth to 435 ships by 2030. We currently have a battle force of 291 ships, and the expected growth rate, and this is in accordance with the CNO's most recent navigation plan, of 381 ships.
First, on the size of the force, the PRC has got about 83 truly relevant combatant surface vessels, cruisers, destroyers, and these are Luyang 2, Luyang 3, Renhai. The Jankai frigates have got some game, but a lot are these sort of smaller combatants that are less relevant open ocean. And if you take the relative combat power of a Liu Yang against the combat power of a Arleigh Burke, it's about 0.6x for the PRC ship tonnage and really range, capability, the sophistication of the ship itself. And
Point 6. So the Type 052 is considered to be 0.6 of an Arleigh Burke. So this is really news to me. I don't have the intelligence that the admiral has to say whether this is accurate or not. Looks a bit low, in my opinion. But well, this is the intelligence assessment. So let's take it for what it is. It is true that the Chinese Navy, the modern ships of the Chinese Navy, are still not that many. The admiral says 83, which is about right considering the information that is in the public domain. But the point is that this is changing very, very, very quickly. We all know the Chinese naval construction capacities, and we know how intensely they're working. So the situation is quickly changing in favor of China, which, I remind you, doesn't have, and it will never have in the foreseeable future, any global responsibility as the US Navy has. So they will always have this advantage. But there is something that leaves me a bit perplexed, which is the fact that the admiral is sort of dismissing, or it seems to dismiss, the rest of the Chinese Navy, which is not as modern and as capable as the most recent ships, because they don't have this blue water capability. But while the Chinese attribute a lot of importance in defending their brown waters, and for brown waters, we have to consider also the South China Sea, which is absolutely vital for China. In fact, it's the area in the world, and probably I would say the only area in the world, to be honest, after the recent developments with India, where the Chinese are really aggressive. Which doesn't mean that they're not doing other stuff around the world, but the area where they are really concerned is the South China Sea. And having such a large force available to defend these brown waters, because that's what they are at the end of the day, I don't think it could be easily dismissed. even even though you consider them not particularly capable, you still can't ignore them. Even if a Chinese corvette has no way of defending from, say, I don't know, a couple of LRASM, that's still a couple of high-end weapons that you have to spend to neutralize it, because if you don't, it will create problems. I don't want to say the usual thing, but I think I will say it. Quantity has a quality on its own.
the 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 U.S. Joint Force and the U.S. Maritime Force continues to have overmatch. There are
Yes, it's true. I totally agree with the Admiral. Today, the US and Allied forces have the overmatch. The question is, for how long?
we are in the middle of a new epoch of warfare where smaller unmanned capabilities are going to have a lot of relevance, particularly in tight geographies. But you will have to cross the mass of that ocean, and those oceans will be contested. Quantity and mass are eternal principles of war.
I agree with the Admiral. It's another way of saying that you can't get away from quantity with quality alone. Quality is useful, but you still need quantity. And this is a lesson that the Russians, the Chinese, never forgot.
But now we're seeing these relationships grow between Russia, who's got a lot of game, and the PRC. Are there technology transfers that are going to help them each regain that ground? And not for nothing, but also the Russia is greatly expanding its combat capability in the Pacific because Russia also sees that the Indo Pacific is a locus of comprehensive national power and has significant interest in the Indo-Pacific.
So this is an extremely good point. If you read Tom Clancy's books like I did when I was young, you may have the impressions that the Russian submarines are technologically behind what the United States can deploy, while it was at the time when Tom Clancy was writing in the 80s and the 90s. It's no longer the case. The most recent Russian submarines are more or less on par, even though they have different concepts and different missions. But technologically, they have a very small gap with the United States. The Chinese do have problems with their submarine arm. They are indeed lagging behind. But if the Russians start transferring technology to the Chinese, considering their production capability, their capability of doing everything very quickly, twice as fast as the West does, well, even that gap could be closed quite quickly.
The thing I like to point out when people want to point to the stat sheet, the box score numbers wise, and also the threat of hypersonics. That's always like the hypersonic missile makes even the Ford class nothing but a grape. You can't defend against it. But when you say Fujian, even with emails versus a Nimitz or Ford class, I like to think of sortie generation rates. Not to mention power projection. Like you said, they have some years to figure it out. And so when I hear that whether it's India or whomever has a conventional carrier, I'm like, have at it. Just doing cyclic ops is such a challenge, and we've done it for 100 years plus.
And this is one of those situations which I don't like. Or Carroll here is not understanding that the missions of the Chinese or the Indian carriers, for what matters, is not the same as the US carriers. Not that sortie generation is not an important metric, but the underlying thinking is that there will be a one on one confrontation between two carrier groups. Sorry, that will never, never happen. It can happen only by mistake if one of those unforeseeable circumstances bring two carrier groups nearby and they end up fighting each other. But at that stage, probably the Indians or the Chinese will retreat under the coverage of their own friendly forces. So if you think that there's going to be another battle of the Midway against China in the near future, there's zero chance. Maybe 50 years in the future, in the long term, but in the long term, 50 years in the future, I will be dead.
The Davidson window, my good friend and classmate Phil Davidson, two ahead of you in the Indo-PACOM job, he was saying, okay, the Davidson window when Xi has the ability to take Taiwan is 2026, 2027. Let's say it gets moved to the left and it happens today. Are you confident that we can prevail?
Yes.
And here you have it. The conventional wisdom, if you read the publications of American think tanks, is that there is a window of danger from now to, let's say, the beginning of 2030s, because by the 2030s there will be some systems, new systems in service that will make the US position and eventually Taiwan position unassailable. So the risk is now, because now the Chinese may have the capability of actually attacking and invading Taiwan, while the US and the Allied forces in the Pacific are not strong enough, potentially, to prevent this to happen. Well, here's your answer. The commander of those forces is believing that he has enough forces, clearly, without hesitation. Now, it's difficult to think that he would say something different, but if he was really concerned, he would have used different words, he would have phrased this differently. I recently said this: if war must be, it is in the interest of the United States to happen as soon as possible, because the Chinese are getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And no, their economy won't collapse, no, their demography won't collapse. They will get stronger and stronger and stronger to the point where they will believe that the United States are no longer a threat. However, to get there may take a couple of decades. So it is in the interest of the United States that if you really want a war, it must be now.
And then start putting together those systems, which independently, the product of which overall shrinks the vulnerability of your system that you're trying to operate. But we must have an answer for the PLARF, for the PLARF. We've got to have an answer, or rather for the PLARF and for the PLAF, for the People's Liberation Air Force and the People's Liberation Rocket Force. There's no sneaking under, there's no sneaking around, there's no little bit of technology that's going to overcome the principles of warfare. And in this case, it's mass, it's maneuver, it's surprise.
Well, I totally agree with the Admiral. You need to have a reply for the Air Force and, crucially, for the Rocket Force. But the consequence of this information is that probably today that reply is not adequate. I personally believe this currently is the most important and outstanding question mark about a confrontation between China and the US. And this is the reason why I recently made a video about a confrontation between the ballistic and anti-ballistic capabilities of the two sides in the Western Pacific. If you're interested, I suggest you to have a look.
I don't see success without the ability to at least achieve episodic air superiority so that we can continue to operate inside those near geographies, like the Taiwan Strait, like the South China Sea, like the Senkakus, the Ryukyus, or the home islands of Japan, like the Korean Peninsula and the Philippine.
This is another interesting point because so far, air superiority, air dominance has always been considered a prerequisite for doing anything else in the West, in the NATO doctrine, the US doctrine. Here we are talking, well, maybe we may not have it. We may be happy with having it sometimes.
Another reason is the reason the semiconductors is the highest end semiconductors are designed in the United States. The lithography is built in the Netherlands, and the fabrication occurs on Taiwan, where 56% of the world's high end semiconductors are fabricated at TSMC and Foxconn.
As I said at the beginning, there is no reason that it needs to be so. There are fabs in the United States at a smaller scale. There are still some fabs in Europe. Why are we buying everything from Taiwan? Well, the answer is obvious because the costs associated are convenient, is an economic convenience. But from a strategic point of view, it doesn't need to be Taiwan.
Stability is underpinned by deterrence. Deterrence is underpinned by real combat capability. Uh, you and I, having flown an hour or two, are probably the biggest pacifists there are because we know the cost.
I wholeheartedly agree with the Admiral that stability is underpinned by deterrence. The fact that these two gentlemen are the biggest pacifists that there are. Come on. Anyway, I hope you thought it was interesting as it was for me. A number of interesting concepts came out of this, and I thought it was worth discussing with you. I repeat again, watch the entire interview on Lord Carroll's channel because it is an excellent channel that is definitely worth following. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much to all those who are supporting the channel on Patreon or by being a member or by any other of the means available. There is also available a GoFundMe fundraiser, which is connected with a book that I'm trying to write. If you're interested, the link will be on screen and in the comment below. Well, this is the end. Thank you very much for watching again, and see you next time.